One of the coolest things in the Pokemon franchise, in my opinion, are the different Pokemon forms. Pokemon have different forms. These can vary based on the type of form that they are. Some are connected to gimmicks, some are not, some are connected to the region they're in, all kinds of cool stuff. And that's exactly what we'll be talking about today and kind of trying to classify these different forms. Because while encoding, all of these are just listed as alternate forms, these are all different types of forms. A Rotom in the washer machine form is different from a combat breed Paldean Tauros, right? So that is what we're going to be looking at today, as well as talking about a few Pokemon that we know have alternate forms, but we've actually never gotten to see these. Welcome back to the Lumiose Post, where we talk about all things Pokemon, and today talking about Pokemon forms. So first, let's go over the types of different forms. Introduced in Generation 7, we have probably the most popular, the most beloved, and that is regional forms, and really regional variants is what we should call these. These are variations of Pokemon, not necessarily forms. These are your things like, as I mentioned earlier, Paldean Tauros, or even your things like Alolan Ninetales, Galarian Weezing, and of course the original counterpart of those two, right? Like Cantonian Ninetales, this would be an example of regional variation. We know this to especially be true because some Pokemon, like Alolan Exeggutor, is stated to be the original Alolan. So technically, if only one of these is a variant of the other, well, the Cantonian Exeggutor is the variant. Same would be said for the Galarian Zigzagoon line. We even kind of have smaller forms of regional variation that are not as drastic as these regional forms that we love and know. You know, that they're not changing Ninetales from a fire type to an ice type, but small things like how Gastrodon, if they're found on the east side, they're a certain color, and if they're found on the west side, they're a different color. Things like how based on where a Burmy is, it'll adapt a different type of cloak. And even Arbok, I think a lot of people have forgotten this, but Arbok was like kind of the OG regional variant because its markings actually differed based on the region that you found Arbok in. This is something that they've kind of stopped doing with Arbok, which I think is lame, by the way, but it was a thing. You even could say that the anime has a few examples of these, like how there's an island in the Orange Islands called Pinken Island where all the Pokemon happen to be pink. Though the thing that differs with this one is we can actually trace that the reason these Pokemon are pink are because of their diet, so it's not necessarily because of the part of the map they're found in or the part of the world they're found in. With true regional variants like Alolan Ninetales, it seems that there were much more environmental pressures causing Ninetales to change from a fire type to an ice type, but in these cases it actually seems like probably a Rhyhorn on Pinken Island would be born normal, but just as it eats all the food on Pinken Island, it gradually develops a pink hue. Similar to how in the real world, flamingos are actually white, but because they eat a lot of shrimp, they get that more pink hue to them. Then we have size variation. This one's actually a little bit tricky because with size variation, this is something we see with all Pokemon. All Pokemon can be different sizes, but they actually are classified as a different form with the Pumpkaboo line, and it affects battle functionality, right? Like, a smaller Pumpkaboo is actually faster than a supersized Pumpkaboo. But again, this only exists with the Pumpkaboo line. With all other Pokemon, with Bulbasaur, with Pikachu, Charmander, all of them, the size variation of them isn't going to affect how they work in battle. So I did want to kind of give a special shout out to size variation because in the case of Pumpkaboo and Gourgeist, it does seem to be a true type of form or variation. Then we have gender variants. Gender variants, again, can exist on a small scale, like how Pikachu has a little heart-shaped tail if it's a female, but does not have this. It's more lightning-shaped if it's a male. And this can get even more drastic with Pokemon like Meowstic and affecting kind of the moves that they learn, or Basculegion affecting their base stat total, Oinkologne. There's a lot of examples of gender variation being a kind of extreme case. Salandit, Combee, these are Pokemon that based on their gender will not be able to evolve or will be able to evolve. The gender's going to dictate that. So it definitely varies per Pokemon, but this would be another type of form. We have other variations like Poltergeist, how you can have an authentic form of Poltergeist and a non-authentic form. You have things like how the Dunsparce can be 3-segment or it can be 2-segment, and this kind of is built on chance. And things like Urshifu, where based on the fighting style they were taught as a Kubfu is going to dictate the kind of Urshifu they are. So these are like, some of these are based on how they evolved even, which is really, really interesting. You also kind of, in the anime, have some exclusive ones there too that we can't really figure out what the variation is here, but some great examples are how there was this oddly colored Toxapex that appeared in the anime. This wasn't a shiny Toxapex. It doesn't look like a shiny Toxapex, but it was a thing that happened, and we have to acknowledge that. And also the Crystal Onix over in the Orange Islands would be another example of just a Pokemon that has a different variation. This one seems closer to regional variants, but since this is specific to one Onix and not all the Onix that inhabit the Orange Islands or this part of the Orange Islands, it definitely makes it a little bit weirder. Then we have temporal variations. These are Pokemon that their appearance is going to vary based on the time. Now, the one that we classify as this would be Deerling and Sawsbuck, but the thing is, this actually kind of doesn't work anymore, maybe. When these Pokemon were first introduced, they would vary in appearance based on the season. But now, in Scarlet and Violet, you can go on the same day and catch a Winter Sawsbuck and a Summer Sawsbuck. It's no longer based on that. It seems to be more environmental based, like Burmy or Gastrodon, or even like a regional variant, but again, not to that extent. So it seems like it's no longer temporal, but maybe the time of year can affect it too. That one's kind of a weird one, and they need to be a bit more consistent on that for us to be able to make a final call. And then we have our true alternate forms. And what I mean by this is these are kind of the things that I think of as a real form of a Pokemon. You know, these are where a Pokemon can switch between two forms, like how Arceus, depending on the different plate it has a different form, or Rotom can go into a different device and become a different form of Rotom. Shaman having a Sky form, Dialga, Palkia, Giratina having their origin forms. There's a lot of examples of these, too many to list, but those are kind of what I see as a true form, not a variation or not something else, but something that the Pokemon can switch between. And then with this, true forms, you can kind of break that down a little bit further. You have gimmick forms. These are going to have you use a gimmick to access this in the Pokemon. So this would be your thing like Mega Evolutions. This is kind of an alternate form, even though we call it an evolution. Given that it doesn't work like a true evolution, I would say it's closer to a form, or things like Gigantamax forms, even the Terrestrial states that exist for Ogerpon and Terapagos. And then also, too, you could make the argument Ultra Necrozma as one of these, because I have to use a Z-move to activate this. But this seems so untied to the Z-move, despite me having to use the Z-move to get this form, that I almost feel wrong including that as a gimmick form. But I guess that is what we have right now for it. And then you also have ones where I feel like they shouldn't even be classified as different forms, like Koraidon and Miraidon having these different forms based off kind of what they're like, if their wings are out or if they're on all fours, or, you know, I think that's kind of lame. I don't really like that. I don't like that that's a thing, that we're classifying just these Pokemon in different stances or with their wings up or down, classifying it as a different form. I don't like that, but whatever. And we do have ones where it's just parts of a Pokemon. Like, we are told in the Journeys anime, which is, you know, the one that took place in Gen 8, that Phalanx, the different parts of it actually have a name. The main one is called the Leader, and then the one that you see at the front and center commanding the other Phalanx, and then the rest of it is called the Brass. So this one's kind of confusing, because while that's technically like forms of Phalanx, there's the Brass and there's the Leader, they also kind of are their own individuals, so I feel like they shouldn't be their own Pokemon in the first place, but that's a can of worms that I really don't want to open today. But so what are examples of Pokemon that we know have other forms, but we haven't been able to see them? Because there's actually a lot of these in games, guys. This is actually pretty crazy. And we're going to try to talk about these forms and classify them in the previous classifications we've named. So first off, we have Mimikyu. This is kind of the one I always think of. We know that Mimikyu actually doesn't look like Mimikyu. It has fashioned this cloak itself and wears it to kind of shield its appearance from everyone, because its appearance can, well, kill you. And also, it does this to model itself after Pikachu, a beloved Pokemon that it's envious of. So, we don't know what this form looks like. And the fun fact is, we never will, because if you look at it, you will die. So, you'll just have to ask Meowth from Team Rocket what it looked like, because he was able to come back. But yeah, this is a form that would exist under the cloak. I would call this a true alternate form, as Mimikyu could hypothetically switch between having a cloak and not having a cloak. So it is a form that Mimikyu can switch between. Then we have Paras and Parasect. So the thing about Paras and Parasect is that it has a fungus on it. And what would it look like if it did not have that fungus on it? That would actually be a different form of this Pokemon. Though the fact that Paras and Parasect is coming from the word parasite makes me think that perhaps this is not in reference to the body, but to the actual fungus that's inhabiting this cicada-like Pokemon. So this might not actually be a case of a new form, and might instead be a case of a just completely new different Pokemon. If it is a form, though, you would classify this as a variation, as it would just be a Paras that never got infected by the parasite. So that's how it varies. And this would be called, I guess, the survivor form, right? Because it didn't get eaten alive by a fungus. Now, one of my favorite ones are actually ancient forms of Pokemon. There are some Pokemon, this kind of goes without saying, right? Like, this is the case with real-world animals, that looked very different a long time ago than they do now. We don't know a ton of these, but we kind of get some confirmed over time, like how we saw that Kalosian Gudra clearly evolved from Hisuian Gudra over time, talking about macro evolution, not the micro evolution we see with Pokemon. But we actually know of two other examples of this. So we know Magikarp and Dunsparce. So Magikarp, it's said that in the past it actually was powerful. Now, there's a chance that Magikarp still looked the same and just was a lot stronger, but given that that would change its base stat total, it still would be an alternate form. And then there is also the chance, too, that, come on, since it's so much stronger in the past, I imagine it looked a little bit less pathetic, and probably had an appearance maybe a little bit closer to Gyarados. Maybe this is a Magikarp that never had to evolve into Gyarados. Then with Dunsparce, we're told that in ancient times it could fly. Now Dunsparce kind of only flies a little, you know, it's not quite this majestic being that the Pokedex seems to portray it as in the past. So I imagine that Dunsparce in the past would have just been a Dunsparce with larger wings, maybe a less rotund body, so like more slender to kind of make it a easier body to lift with its wings, right? A more hollow body. And yeah, I mean, maybe it had the flying type too, maybe it had different stats, but we do know that Dunsparce apparently in the past was a great flyer, and I would love to see this ancient form of Dunsparce. Thought we'd get in its evolution, but we didn't, so keeping my fingers crossed that it comes down the line. Then we have Mousehold, and this is another one where it's kind of like Phalanx, right? Like where, well, each one of those should probably be a separate Pokemon anyways, but we're classifying all four or all three or all two as one Pokemon. And there's a lot of questions with this one. I've done a whole video on it. You can check it out. But basically, this one's just weird because what does Mousehold, like, what does one of them, what is that? Is that a form? Is that a one-segment Tandemouse, or is that considered a different Pokemon altogether? Are we just calling that thing Mouse? I don't know. I've done a video on it. I'm not talking about it again because it blows my mind in the worst possible way. Then we also have Revavroom. This is kind of a weird one, but Revavroom, not only do we know of its different forms with the Starmobiles, but there's actually another form that we don't know about, and that is because it is said that this Pokemon is possessed by a Pokemon. It's a bunch of scrap metal that was possessed by a Pokemon. So there's still the question of, what is this Pokemon when it is not possessing scrap metal? And again, maybe this would be considered a new Pokemon altogether. You could speculate that's an existing Pokemon too. Perhaps it's a Ghastly, and that's where the poison type is coming from. But we don't know. We have no confirmation on this. Probably never will get it. So until then, we're classifying that as just a Pokemon that would have another variation, a non-possessed Revavroom, so one that's just wandering the world as a free spirit. Probably the one that got talked the most about in the last year are the Loyal 3. So the Loyal 3 were these Pokemon, and they were given their current look based on Pecharunt's Toxic Chain. So before this, they actually were said to be completely different. Pheasantipiti was said to be very ugly. Munkidori was said to be very stupid. And Okidogi was said to be very weak. So these are Pokemon that went to Pecharunt and were able to, through its Toxic Chain, obtain strength, wisdom, beauty. But we still don't know what the Pokemon look like without the Toxic Chain. We don't know of that stupid Munkidori form, or that weak Okidogi form, or that ugly Pheasantipiti form. And again, this is another one where maybe those would be classified as new Pokemon altogether, and that the Toxic Chain have basically evolved them into Pheasantipiti, Okidogi, or Munkidori. And I'm not talking about a true evolution here like Pikachu to Raichu. I'm talking about something different, like the change that made Carbink become a Diancie. So what is this with the Loyal 3? There's been plenty of videos over the years, both that I've done and that other people have done, on what they could have been. They could have been existing Pokemon. People speculate they could be like a Poochyena, a Pampor, and a Tranquil or something. But we don't have any confirmation. So with that, I'm going to say that these are alternate forms of them. These are alternate variations of them, just ones that never got the Toxic Chain. Now, there are some Pokemon that we do not know they have alternate forms, but we could assume that they do. Any Pokemon that's stated to be from another region that we haven't yet seen, like how Copperajah was brought to the Galar region from another region, but we don't know where that region is. Maybe the Copperajah looked different in that region. Yungoos, same thing, it was brought to Alola. We don't know where from, so if it is from an India region, which a lot of people assume it would be, maybe it has an alternate form there. The best example of this, though, I think, is Corphish. We know that Corphish was brought into the Japanese Pokemon region, so Hoenn, Sinnoh, Kitakami, Johto, Kanto. They were brought from another region. We don't know where that region is, but interestingly enough, if you look at Crawdont's design, you can tell that this Pokemon is mimicking Sharpedo, and that's kind of how it is keeping away predators, right? It's mimicking a Pokemon that is a lot stronger and a lot more feared by other Pokemon and recognized by Pokemon in the Hoenn environment, which is a thing we see in the real world. But the question is, would Corphish in its original region maybe not have to adapt this way to mimic a predator like Sharpedo? Maybe Corphish evolves into a completely different Pokemon or an alternate form of Crawdont that's not Water Dark and does not have similarities to Sharpedo. It's speculative, but I think the fact that Crawdont clearly mimics Sharpedo is a good indicator that it could very well be true. And then we have the fossil Pokemon. It's long been speculated that the fossil Pokemon have been altered due to the restoration process, and this is why they all have the rock type, right? Because we're restoring these Pokemon from a fossil, so basically from like a rock. And people theorize that that's kind of altering one of their types and making it rock. So a Pokemon like Tyrant was not originally Rock Dragon. It was Dragon and maybe something else, maybe Pure Dragon, I don't know. I've done a theory video on what these could have looked like. I've also more recently done an Australian video where in my DLC for this Australian region I made, I actually did give true forms of these Pokemon, so be sure to check out those videos. I have them, they popped up on screen when I talked about them. But yeah, this is something that people have theorized for a long time. I do want to clarify, though, this would only be true for the fossils from Gen 1 through 6, because the Galar fossils, well, their restoration process is a little bit different, because instead we took two fossils that were completely unrelated and restored them together. So with those, we're not looking for an alternate form, a true form of these Pokemon. We're actually looking for the true Pokemon, right? Because Dracovish should actually be a Draco Pokemon and a Vish Pokemon, and they should not be together. So maybe we'll one day know what the true form of those Pokemon were, or the true Pokemon of those were. But I'd love to see, honestly, the true forms of the previous fossil Pokemon and know, was Aerodactyl maybe dragon flying before the fossil restoration process? was Tyrantrum, maybe Dragon Dark, etc., etc. I think this would be so cool to learn. But yeah, so that's the different forms of Pokemon, and some forms that we know are out there, or at least have good reason to believe are out there, but we have never seen. Be sure to let me know which of these, if you could put one of these in the game, which one would it be? Which one would you most want to see in game, most want to catch? Let me know in the comments below. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. It really helps the channel. Thank you all so much for the love and support you've given me so far. And until next time, I will see all of you later.